Perfect. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I am so excited you guys are here today and watching my presentation. We're going to start off with there is more than census records and vital records. To begin, just a review. Review the first steps of basic methodology. So you have your first 3 steps, your preliminary survey, your U.S. Census records, and English and Welsh census records, and then your vital records. So in the preliminary survey, you'll gather all the information you have around your house. And then you'll ask family members if they have any more information, any stories, dates that you may not know of, etc. And then you'll also look at previous family trees. Now with those trees, not everything that might not be documented or sourced. So I always say kind of take those trees with a grain of salt. Use them as a stepping stone, but not as permanent evidence. And then as you're doing your census records, if you're working in the United States Census records or in England and Wales Census records, create a census survey. So you start with what you know and then you work backwards. I have an example here of my 4th great grandfather, John Edward Applegarth. He was alive in 1920. In this example, I have his death and birth as unknown, and then I would start in the 1920, and then I would work back, and then work forward. Now, you can catch all of these steps in my other presentation of basic methodology as well. And then vital records, you have birth, marriage, and death. So after we've done the first steps of basic methodology, where do we go from here? Now, there are several different records you can search. These aren't necessarily the steps you have to go in order to search these records. For this presentation, I have it as in steps just to help the flow with it, but these records might not apply to your research project. You might not have an immigrant. You might be working just in the United States and there's no immigration, so you won't worry about immigration records, things like that, or the naturalization records. But to begin with, we are going to start with county histories. Now, county histories are incredible. They aren't very looked at often. So the county histories can help build your friends, associates, and neighbors. They can include information of the families who first settled in the county. They can also give you different occupations or the government leaders in the county. The county histories can also lead to missing children. So if you're working in census records and there's there's a 10-year gap, you may not have known a child was missing, well, county history can talk about a family and then have a child missing mention the child's name. So after you do your census records, I do recommend looking in county histories next. Because if you did find missing children, then you can go add them to your research and find their vital records. County histories can be accessed at Family Search Wiki or a Google search to help with that. After county histories, we then have church records. Now, church records include marriage bans, marriage bonds, burials, baptisms, and christenings. Church records are accessible at FamilySearch.org, Family Search Wiki, Family Search Catalog, Ancestry.com, and Microfilm. Marriage bans were given a few weeks before the marriage happened in the couple's church. So at this point, they'll say, do you agree with Jane and Doe and John Smith to get married? If any objections, please object. And that will do it for 3 weeks. That will give you the name of the bride and the groom. And then after marriage bans, we have marriage bonds, which is a guarantee of promise of payment. The groom's name would be present, an apostle relative of the bride named to a promised legal wedding. So if the bride is underage, then you'll have the father or the guardian, depending on if the father is alive, signature, giving permission that she can marry. So when you're looking at marriage bonds or marriage records, always double check the backside to see if there's a signature of the father if the bride is underage. And then if you're working in the southern or mid-Atlantic states, they did marriage bonds up to mid-1800s. So it depends on the area, location that you're working on, if there's marriage bonds or not. And then you have burials. Burials have the name of the deceased, their deceased parents' names, especially if they're minors, the spouse of the deceased if they were married, location of burial, and their birth location. Then after burials, we have our baptisms and christenings. These involve individual names, parents' names, if they're illegitimate or legitimate, date of baptism and christening, and name of witnesses. Now, the illegitimate and legitimate part's important because if they're illegitimate, they would not be listed in the father's probate or will. If they're legitimate, then they would be listed in the will as like an heir to the estate, or they get this kind of thing. And then the witnesses. Now, if you're working in Scandinavian records or Mexican records, like church records, and there's other areas too, the names of witnesses can be grandparents. The church records are they're a gold mine, because they can list the parent's name and both sides of the grandparents. So the mother's parents and the father's parents. And then also the witnesses can be friends, neighbors. They can also be completely random individuals, but that's not likely the case. So you can use those to help distinguish if you have the correct ancestor. After our church records, we have city directories. City directories have become one of my favorite records in the last few months as I've been working more in them. So city directories can help with large areas of research. It can also help narrow down an individual with a common name. It can also help establish neighbors and occupants and missing family members. But not only that, it will give you the residents, where they're living, where they're working at. It can also give you especially in 1920 and on, it'll give you the spouse's name, so the wife's name. If the wife is a widow, it will give you her name and widow of. It also lists people who have died. And I'm not talking about recently. There's been one in 1932, and they talked about one who died in 1929. So like there's different gaps, but it mentions who. So don't forget to look at the city directories because they give more insight than what we think. You can access them at Family Search Wiki to see. You can also access them on Family Search Catalog. And I know on Family Search Catalog, some areas where it says directories will be like business directories. So you can look through there too. Ancestry.com, FamilySearch.org. And then you can also look on the online directory site. And that one was actually new to me too. I didn't know about that until a couple months ago. After city directories, we have tax records. Now, tax records is the value of the property. They kept track of how much an individual had. So if you notice in the census records, if you look at the value of their real estate, if it goes up or down between census records, you know they either bought more land or they sold their land. Now, if you're working in pre-1850, tax records are your best friend to work in them. And then after you do tax records, as I have it here, you would go to the land records, like grantor, grantee, because that telling you that there is land. And then you have Family Search Wiki, Ancestry.com, or Family Search to access the tax records. Now, my next slide isn't land records, that's later on. My next slide is immigration, and like I said, if it's applicable. So immigration records are also important. There's the passengers lists. On the passengers lists, it gives the ship's name, date of arrival, the date they left, the name, the ages. Also, if they're traveling in family, you can look at the entire list and see. It won't say like head of household or relationship to head of household, but it will give you their occupation, which will help you follow them along on their journey. If you're working in Canada and they come to the United States, you can look in the Canada boarding crossing records. And then the census records have immigration years. So in the census records, I believe I do talk about this in basic methodology, but the census records, they do in the 1900, 1910, and I think 1920, I'm trying to remember. It'll have the immigration year, and then it'll also state if they are naturalized. So in that time frame, if it's NA, it means it's naturalized. If it's a P, it means they're working on their papers. And if it's an AL, it means alien for that time frame. So if you're working in Pioneer time for Latter-day Saints, you can go over to Mormon Pioneer Overland Travel and look at the company's name to see who they traveled in, when they traveled across the plains, how long it took. Sometimes it'll be captain notes of those groups, and they will also list possible deaths that happened along the trail, give you more historical context of what's going on. So immigration records can be accessible on Mormon Pioneer Overland Travel, Mormon Migration, Ancestry.com, FamilySearch.org, Ellis Island, Family Search Wiki, Family Search Catalog, and the BYU Center for Family History and Genealogy. That's also a good place to look at for immigration. The next is naturalization and citizenship. So naturalization records in 1906, only federal courts could naturalize. In 1850, between 1850 and 1922, women were able, it's like the umbrella. If their husbands became naturalized, then they were naturalized. They took it upon their husbands. Same with children. And then in 1940 Registration Act, all immigrants had to register. Then you have your Social Security, and then World War I draft registration would have, if they are naturalized. You can look at voter registration lists, and you can look at passport applications as well. So those are helpful. And then we have probate records. In probate records, we have wills, petitions, court orders, notices, and inventories. Now I will go step through step on these. So you can access these on Family Search Wiki to see when records are available. FamilySearch.org, Ancestry.com, and Family Search Catalog. Family Search Catalog will become your best friend, same with the wiki, as you are looking more into these records. With the catalog, you can look at the area that you're working in, and it'll tell you when, like, what probate records are online or not, and that goes with most of the records as well. So to begin with probate records, we have the court administration and probate. So you have the petition to administer. Testate is a will. Intestate is no will. So when you come across something that says they died in testate, it means they have a will. But if they died in intestate, I know that those words just, there's no easier way to explain it. They died with no will. Typically, if they have no will, you will have a huge probate file of petitions and inventories and notices, which we'll be going through. And then you also have the bequest of personal property. You have written wills, which is in the hand of the person. An unwritten will is he or she were taken over by sudden illness, or they died unexpectedly, then they didn't have time to make a will. And then you have the holographic wills, which is a handwriting in the deceased. And then the nucapative will is an oral will. So someone's saying, this is what I want, by mouth. So there's like no handwriting or anything. So what is the purpose of a probate, though? To determine heirs of descendant, settle affairs of descendant, and transfer titles of property. Now, wills can be gold mines. I have seen many wills that have been a gold mine. As I mentioned before, if they died intestate, they had a will. And in the composition of a will, you have the preamble in the name of God, amen, identifying the testate, disposal of sound and body. So if they were sane and could write this, then that's good. And then where their grave, where they're buried. Then you also have their debts of being paid. And then their specific bequests, so gifts who they want to give to, who they want to give it to. They also have the administration, so it's the creditor's claims that are processed. So if, once again, they have debt, then the creditors will take all the money that there's owed to them before the money's else is given rest to the family. Then you have the sales of the real estate property. So real estate doesn't move around. So it's like land or the house. And then you have the personal property, which moves around. So like furniture, clothes, books. So things that move is personal. Things that are permanent on the ground, land, house, houses, are real estate. And then you have the determination of widow rights. So, and I think I talk about this later on, but if I don't, I'm going to talk about it right now. In the determination of widow rights, the widow can have the husband might say the widow can have his land until she got remarried or until his son became of age. So she doesn't get to keep the land. And then you have the guardian for minors. Yes, the children didn't just go straight to the mother after the father died. There had to be this whole process for her in order to get her children. And then you had the bond changes, the resignations, and the revocations. And then the final settlement, who gets what. You also have the executor who will give you, who's in charge of the will of making sure things go how it needs to go. And then you have the decree of distribution, the beneficiaries, and for the testate, and then the intestate to the heirs. So, what happens when an ancestor dies without a will? You're probably wondering. Known as intestate. So it's a long process, but there are many records. Once again, if they don't have a will, it can also be a gold mine. I should also mention, if they have a will, someone can still petition that will. And then you have a whole process of probate. So you'll have petitions, court records, inventories, notices without a will. But you can also have it with the will if someone went to petition it, which I have seen in my own family research. So the petition is an heir, a creditor, or a person that has an interest of the person's estate can say, hey, I want that land. I'm going to file this. And then in the petition, it'll name the heirs, so that helps distinguish the relationship and how they're related to the deceased, which will continue to build your family, your foundation, your friends, associates, and neighbors. And then we'll also have the residents listed, which is also really good to have. So after the petition, we have court orders. And this is just the brief description of the case and judgment. The court orders can be for granting citizenship, appointment of guardians, and re-recording of deeds. So this happens if the deed was destroyed, or the land record is destroyed, it will be recreated to have that. After court orders, we have notices. Notices are, now this is so important, are published in newspapers. And I'll talk about newspapers later on, but check out those newspapers because you will be able to find the notices of the deceased property. So if a creditor or someone else was interested, so like today, if you're like looking on for estate sales, newspapers or on social media, it's like this. They published it in the newspaper, so the creditors are like, hey, I want my money, I'm gonna go get my money. Or you have those who are like, hey, I like estate sales, I'm gonna go and see if I can, get some of this stuff, kind of thing. Then you have the inventories, which lists all the personal properties and the value of what it was at. And so these the inventories will include the tools and the description of the land, and at the time, if it was during the era of if they had slaves, it will list their slaves. And then they will be in a probate packet. So how can we find these probate records? You need to identify where the county where your ancestor died. Then this is, and I should have switched this around, but this is what I would do. Once I knew where the county is that my ancestor passed away in, I'll check the catalog and the wiki to see if they have that. And if I can't find it, then I would check the historical records on familysearch.org. And if I'm still not finding it, then I'll check Ancestry Red Book. And I know you could also probably check Ancestry Card Catalog as well. You could also do just a Google search of the county and probate records. So after probate records, we have land records. As I mentioned before, tax records will give you the idea to look for land records. Same with probate records. Same with censuses. So in land records, we have the land patents, the deeds, the grantor grantee index, the dower claims, the headright bounty, and this was during the colonial time. State land grants, so the state is in charge of giving land to the individual, or you have federal land records or federal land grants, and this is usually like bounty land warrants. So if they served in the wars, they would get it. You also have the Homestead Act in 1862 where they can get land. So you can access these records at familysearch.org, Family Search Wiki, Family Search Catalog, Ancestry.com, and glowrecords.blm.gov. Glow Records do, I just forgot what it was called. It's not Meets and Bounds. It's the other one where you have the townships. My mind went blank there. So I apologize, but I do talk about it here in the next 3 slides. So the importance of land. Land plays an important role in all of history of the United States. Honestly, most likely the history of the world, because people are always wanting land. People are always wanting to take land from other people, to conquer. You know, land records are the oldest surviving records of any jurisdiction. They go all the way back to the 1600s. Here are just a few key concepts to understand land. So, as I mentioned before, so you have estate, which is all property owned, but the real is if you can't move it, it's permanent, or personal, it's movable. Then you have land tenants, which is real estate. And then you have hereditament. I probably misspoke that. Anything that can be inherited. So anything. And then you have the easement, which is the right that is connected to the land. So how, like, if I had connection to the land, like, it would be my right to have that land. What do land records obtain? Now, these are really cool. So you have the name of the grantor, which is the seller, the name of the grantee, which is the buyer, the date and place of transaction, the description of the land. So if you're working in meets and bounds, it will give you the full description, or if you're working in township ranges, it will give you the range of how it is, the price of the piece of land, the neighbors that are living next to the land, and the person or persons who had previously owned the land. In some land records, it will also state the wife. Very rarely, but I have seen it. So the land patents will be name of the individual, the date, the legal description of the land, the patent number, and where the land office that it was issued in. So if you're looking for like a plat map, you can contact the land office to see if they have it. You can also look online to see. Deeds. These are very similar to land records. They have the name of the grantor, the grantee, date and place of transaction, description of land, price of the piece of land, neighbors next to it. But what they also include are the warranty section. So that means the seller, if the seller is liable for future problems, then the buyer can talk to them. And then the signature witnesses, seals of acknowledgement. So this is what we need. So the execution sections, and then the full name of the wife. So when I mentioned land records, I was thinking deeds. So yes, full name of the wife. It's on this. Then you have the new location of the previous owner. So where that owner is going next, which is incredible, because if you have lost track of your individual and he was the grantor selling his land, and it mentions, hey, I'm going to throw a name, James Long. I can't find James Long. I know he sold his land to his brother, Robert Long. But in that deed, it will state where James Long went. So he went to a whole other city. So it'll help you keep track of movement of pattern there too. And then the new deed will also mention the previous location of the buyers. So like his brother Robert Long may lived in the area that James Long is going to, and that would mention that. So this helps you keep track of your family, of where they've been moving to, if you have the right family, if you have the right foundation, like the right people, the right neighbors. So after we have our deeds, we then have our grantor and grantee index. So as I mentioned before, the grantor is the seller, the grantee is the buyer. The grantor and grantee index is just the index, will give you the volume and the page number for the deed book. So to find the deed, you'll go to your grantor and grantee index, find either or, because they will both be listed. Then you'll have your volume and your page number. So then you go back to the books, go to the volume, and go to the page number, and then you'll find the land deed. You can find this online, but if it's on microfilm, when you're looking on your family search catalog to see what records are available, you still use this information, you still apply it to microfilm. So after the grantee and grantor index, we have the dower claims. Now, as I mentioned before in the wills, if the husband dies, then the wife will get a portion of his estate during her lifetime. But if she is to remarry, she will lose it. She will not have that portion. It will go to the rest of the family. Then we have the headright bounty. This is 50 acres, could be bought or sold. Men were granted for this bounty by migrating himself or other people to the colonies. So like I said, this is colonial time. If you are working in colonial time, this is where you also need to look in. So land records, tax records, censuses, they're really nice key records for colonial time. In pre-1850 time too. So then you have the state land grants. Just to give a brief history, you had the 13 colonies. 7 of the states did not give their unclaimed land to the federal government when the federal government became the United States. Then this land is surveyed by meets and bounds. And then we have federal land grants. So remember, I could not remember what it was called. It's the rectangular survey grid. So state land grants are meets and bounds. Federal land grants are the rectangular survey grid. And that one you can find on the GLO records. So you have the bounty land warrants, and the measured, and it's like I said. But then you also have the different type of grants. So you have the homestead grants, which I mentioned earlier, the 1862 one, grants to the states, grants to railroads and other, military bounty lands, and private land claims. I have seen in my own research doing land records that some of my own ancestors actually sold land to the railroad companies, and it will state the railroad, whatever the company is, so company railroad. And it's interesting because it talks about like what land they gave, and so like building that with the railroad, knowing hey, there's like a railroad, is really cool. Because one day I'll go visit their land and be like, this used to be part of your land, now it's not because it's the railroad. After land grant, land records, now we move on to military records. So military records, there's a few. We have the service records. So in the militia, the volunteer, and the regular forces, we have the muster in rolls and the mustered out rolls. We have the payrolls, the regimental and company descriptive rolls, pension records and bounty land warrants, enlistment records, and draft records. You can access this on FamilySearch.org. The nps.gov, ancestry.com, county websites, Google search, Fold 3, and the National Archives. If you're working in Civil War era, the NPS is really good for that one too. So the service records, the militia, the volunteer, the regular forces, these records have they're proving their involvement in the military. So if you suspected they served in the military, but you weren't sure, and you find a service record, well, this gives you proof that they did serve in the military. Some of these records are available online. The best way to find them online is to go to Family Search Wiki. National Archives would have them as well, so you can always contact the National Archives and ask for more information about the service records. Then we have the muster in rolls. So the muster in rolls are the roll call, the unit they served in, so depending on the time period and what war they're serving in, if they were serving in a war, if they were just serving, the responsibility that they had, also the other lists of soldiers that they served with. So this could be friends, this could be family members, this could be associates. And then you have their placement of enlistment and date. So after muster in rolls, we have the muster out rolls. This is their last roll call before they head home. This is where injuries will be listed if they had received any. And this is the last day paid for the military service. So I have an ancestor. He served in the Civil War and he actually got an injury in his right eye. So in his muster out roll, it stated he has an injury in his right eye. And it also states that in his pension record too. So knowing, okay, his name's not very common as is, but if it was a common name, that his muster out roll is stating he has an injury in his eye, and his pension record is stating that this guy has this injury in his eye, I know I have my right guy. So these can go hand in hand as you're trying to find these records and you're not sure. Well, if they have an injury and it's listed in the pension record and you find this too, then you know this is your right individual. And then you have the regimental and company descriptive roles. Now this is pretty cool. And you can also look on this on the draft records too of like World War II and World War I. But you have their name, their rank, their age, their physical description. So like how tall they are, their eye color, their hair color, their skin color. So not only is it just a record, but now you can have an image in your head of what your ancestor looks like. And then you have their marital status. So if they're married, but yet you've not been able to find a spouse, then okay, now you know they're married. Then now you can go look for a marriage record. Or if they're widowed, then you know that their spouse is deceased if you didn't already know that. Service information. After these roles, we have the pension records and bounty land warrants. The pension records are to the officers, to disabled veterans, to needy veterans, widows and orphans of veterans, veterans who served in a certain length of time. The pension application will have their name and the maiden name of the wife, so that's good. If you've not been able to find your ancestor's wife's maiden name this entire time and you've looked high and low, well, now you have her maiden name. His rank, his military unit, his period of service, his residence, his age, his date, place of birth, marriage, and death. If it's a widow's pension. The nature of disability, a proof needed, the discharge papers. Widows and heirs had to prove relationship. The bounty land warrants were first an incentive to have the men serve in the military, but then that became a reward later. Now with the widows pension, I also have that in that same ancestor I was just telling you about. In her pension application, she had to prove that her children were his children. So she had all the children listed, their birth date, their location, where their birth. If I have not already been able to find any of that information, like let's say that this was actually the first record I came across, which ironically I had it in my possession before I even knew I had it in my possession. Then I already know, okay, this proves relationship, that this is the family, that these children are his children and her children, that he did have that injury in his eye. He served in the Civil War, and then he was in the 1890 veteran schedule. So it all helps prove that this is still my guy. So then, after we have pension records and bounty land records, we have the enlistment and discharge records. So you have the soldier's name, the date, place of enlistment, and their muster. And then you have draft records. So this started in 1863, where they were drafted between the ages of 20 to 45. 1940 is when you had selective training and the Service Act come into play. So this is the first peacetime draft, and it continued in 1948 to 1973. Then you have the Selective Service Act, which went into 1917, and this is when the men signed up to go serve in World War I. In World War I and World War II draft records, we have your ancestor's name, occupation, residence, their nearest relative, and their physical description. So nearest relative could be their wife, their father, their mother, their brother, anyone that is a relative to them. After draft records, we have court records. So in court records, we have adoption records, divorce records, naturalization records. Once again, I've already talked about naturalization records, so refer back to that section. And then we also have probate records, which I just barely talked about too. Then we have the dockets, minutes, and orders of the court. Now you can refer also this back to the probate section as well. Then you have judgment case file and indexes. You can access these on Family Search Wiki to see where it's at. If you know the courthouse, you can contact the courthouse to get more information. Court records are for public, are for their public notice, except for adoption records. Adoption records are usually sealed, and you would need a court order to obtain them. So then you have divorce records. So, divorce records name the husband and the wife, other family members, their marital history, their property, their residence, dates of other events, so like children's birth. It might also list if they've had a deceased child, that child's death date. It might. I'm not sure. And then you can contact the clerk to obtain the record. Newspapers will definitely write about it, which I'll talk more about newspapers soon. Then the dockets, so the dockets are the court calendars, the list of cases heard by the court, the names of the plaintiff, defendant, date of the case, case file, and all of the documents are associated on this list. The docket will be the first thing on the court record. It'll be the first page. And then depending on how many, if it's like a big trial, I'll have like all the witnesses for both sides. Also have like what went into like evidence to like show of like pictures kind of thing. So then you have the minutes. Now this will include the names of the plaintiff and the defendant or defendants, depending on how big this case is. You'll also have the notes taken by the clerk. But they're hardly ever indexed, but they are in chronological order. The judgments. So both plaintiff and defendant or defendants will be listed. You'll also have the judgment, the amount of execution. So however long they have to serve if they're serving. The satisfaction date. So when they have to pay their judgment in full. I should also mention that as you're looking at court records, you'll also have, if they have lawyers, you'll have the lawyers listed too. Typically, depending on if it's federal or if it's state or if it's civil, will depend on if like names are listed. It depends though, like on the attorneys, if it will have their first name or not. So the case files, these can be huge. They're all loose documents. So it's not like, here's a binder. Nope. Here's a stack of papers for you to go through. It does help establish family relations. There's copies of evidence in it, testimonies, bonds, depositions, the correspondence, and the petitions, if petitions were given. Then you have the indexes. So you have different type of index for records when you're working in court records. So you have the naturalization record books, the territorial criminal case file books, the citizen certificate stubs, and those are the 2 years, 1907 to 1924 and 1908 to 1928. So you can look at those. And I believe I'm sure they're online. Then to find trial court records, Family Search Wiki, Family Search Catalog. I forgot to update my slide, so it's not Family History Library anymore. It's the Family Search Library. Also has copies of published records and indexes on microfilm too. The researcher, depending if it's you or if you have hired out, will need to call to see if the record is obtainable. Then you can plan a trip to the courthouse, ask where the court records are available. Also ask to search the basement too. Reason why I say search the basement is because there are lots of court records that are forgotten that your ancestors' court records might be in there. So it's always good to search those unforgotten records down in the basement because you might be able to find what you're looking for. Some records may be digitized. You can go to the court's website if you have the case number to request those documents. In order to obtain a case file number, again, is you need to look at the dockets, the minutes, or the index. Now, newspapers. Newspapers are one of my favorite things to look through. There's so much filled with so much information. You have obviously obituaries. There's birth notices, marriage announcements, death notices. But you have stories about your ancestors. I have seen stories about my ancestors in them. But you also have people visiting family members or friends or coming back. I have met some people, I work with some people who just told me a story of how they found a person they were looking for in a newspaper that they've been searching years, this family years, and they were able to find it through the newspaper. Don't just read the little parts of the obituary. Read the entire newspaper because you will find all kinds of information. You'll find information about the probate, divorce notices, migration lists. So if you are working in Latter-day Saint records, you have pioneers, and you're coming across this, if you look in the Utah Digital newspapers in the time frame that they're coming, they list the entire company by name of who came, this way family members can come to them and be like, hey, you're here, because they had no idea when their family member was going to come. Newspapers were a way to connect other people together. Social media today is what newspapers were then, is how people got their information. You can access newspapers at newspapers.com, elephant.com, newspaper archives, genealogy bank, ancestry.com, family search.org, and family search wiki. Newspapers.com, newspaper archives, and genealogy bank are subscriptions, but they're still worth to get. If you have any more questions, you can contact me at my email at untangleyourroots@gmail.com. I do have a website that you can visit. I'm also on Facebook. I'm also on Twitter. I'm also on Instagram. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, Untangle Your Roots. And you can also find my website just Googling Untangle Your Roots too. Now, if you guys can fill out this awesome survey where it's pointed at in the session, and let us I just totally forgot my words. You can fill out the survey, let us know how it went, how the session went. That would be great. That would be very helpful. And then I also have my copyright video. So thank you guys so much for coming. I am so grateful to have the opportunity to present this year at RootsTech. I have felt very united with old friends and new faces and old faces and everything. So thank you for coming.
And thank you. We have had a lot of questions in the chat. There's a lot of people that are really interested and they have a lot that they'd like to know. Would you like to answer some of those questions now?
Yes. Yes.
All right. So let's start. Deborah asked, how do I go about trying to find immigration records from Poland and Romania when great-grandfathers do not appear?
Poland and Romania. So, sorry, I'm trying to totally get her whole question. So her grandparents aren't appearing. Is that what she's saying? Can you read the question again?
It says, how do I go about trying to find immigration records from Poland and Romania when great-grandfathers do not appear?
So you would need to look on Family Search Wiki to see about immigration records for sure. I would need a lot more information to help her. Because it's a more in-depth answer than what I can give right now. But the short answer would be look at Family Search Wiki to see what immigration records are available. And yeah, to see when they're available. And then, yeah, I would need to know if the family came across to the United States. Like, it's an in-depth question. So if she's still watching, I would recommend her emailing me. That way I can answer on a more personal level. Because it's such an in-depth answer than what I can give right now.
All right. Someone asks, Stephen Van Roy asked, is there a proper or good way to go in person to some local church and ask for records?
Read that first part again.
Is there a proper or good way to go in person to a local church and ask for records?
So if you know the church and you know what records you're looking for, first I would see if they're online and available. Second, you can call them up. But if the church is very local, like, you can go and talk to them. But I would be prepared with the information you need, and see what records they have available if they're in person or if you can access them online.
Okay. Michelle Kellis asked, where do we find marriage bonds?
They're in the church records. So depending on where you're working at, well, it depends. So if you're working a lot in England, they will have marriage bonds. If you're working in the southern, like mid-southern Atlantic area, up to the mid-1800s, they have it. It depends, like I said, what religion they're in. Like, if you know the religion, where you can access church records is where those would be. And it breaks it down further, like, of the books that you would look in. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. We are at 5 minutes left before the meeting is technically over. We can go a little over, but we'd like to get through these next questions quickly if we can. Okay. So I'm going to ask a few more. So John Grubbs asked, on a marriage bond, I see witness listed and someone else with sir listed. What does sir mean?
That I'm not sure. I haven't seen anything like that before. Witness listed and Sir listed. I would have to actually go look that up to do some research on that, because I haven't seen that before, but that's a really good question. Like I want to go find it out myself. So I don't have an answer. I don't know. But I will. I need to look that up now for myself.
All right. Patty K asked, is there any record of immigrations entering US through Boston?
Yes. Yes, there is. That is one of the ports. So if you do a Google search for Massachusetts passenger lists, it will pull it up. Boston was one of the ports too. So you have New York, New Orleans, Boston. That you just need to do that Google search. And typically when I'm looking for immigration lists, I'll just do New York passenger list or New Orleans passengers list or Massachusetts. And then I usually use Ancestry, but you can do Ancestry or Family Search. Just keep in mind, spellings would be different on both different databases because they're different databases. They are not the same. So.
All right. Barbara asks, what is the difference between a land patent and a land record?
So I just lost my train of thought. I think it might be in my handout. It might not. But I do have it in my notes. But for time's sake right now, I'm not going to go through my notes. But if you want to email me, I can give you the answer then too. So just that way we're just short on time with questions and answers. And I can't really go through my notes right now.
All right. Ness Young asked, does Indiana have divorce records for 1869?
So that time, divorce is not very common in the 1800s. Divorce doesn't really become more common until probably mid 1900s. Divorce was just kind of a taboo subject, and things had to be really, 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 really bad in order for divorce to happen. So most likely not, but to find that out, you can check the Family Search Wiki or the Family Search catalog of the county that your ancestor was living in to see if they have any records, divorce records at that time.
All right. Well, it looks like we're just about out of time here. So there's a lot more people who have questions, but I don't think we'll quite have time to get to them all.
They can email me any of their questions at untangleyourroots at gmail.com, and I'll be happy to help. Or they can go in the chat box and I can help too, like try and answer questions.